Hi there, and welcome to our next lesson in APUS history. We're looking at the failure of Reconstruction, which is APUSH topic 5.11. I'm your APUSH lady boss. Thanks for joining me. If you want to take some notes while you are watching this video, you can click the link in the description to follow along. The objective that you want to be able to explain after we are done is how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional and national understandings of what it meant to be an American. In the curriculum framework, it emphasizes the economic situation that happened in the South, specifically looking at sharecropping after the war. And additionally, a lot of the violence and local laws that were happening that ended up stripping away African American rights, which resulted really in the failure of Reconstruction. So, start with some historical context. We're going to divide Reconstruction into social, political, and economic changes and continuities, and we will conclude by looking at how Reconstruction officially ends. So, to start, historical context, we have President Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat. He became president after Republican Lincoln was assassinated, and he really was a white supremacist. But at the same time, Congress has many radical Republicans in office who really want to protect the rights of African Americans. And so, what we talked about in our last lesson was the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These amendments were ratified and guaranteed the rights of African Americans. However, did life actually change? That's what we're looking at in this lesson. So, some of the issues that we're going to be talking about are should the Southern economy be, or how should the Southern economy be reconstructed to one without slavery? How should newly freed Black men and women be integrated and protected? And what branch of government controls the process? So here is a really famous quote by W.E.B. Du Bois that I think is really emblematic of how you should think about Reconstruction. The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. So this period of Reconstruction is like a temporary moment in the sun where they have rights and life is incrementally better, but life returns back to one very similar to slavery near the end of Reconstruction and certainly after. So let's start with social changes and continuities. One of the biggest organizations that was created in this time period was the Freedmen's Bureau. Unfortunately, it was never fully funded and it was only in place for a few years. But in those early years of Reconstruction, it did support African Americans by providing food, clothing, housing. They had set up schools for African American children and adults. They helped African Americans find family members whom they had been separated from. They legalized marriages, all kinds of things to support life, especially in the South. Additionally, we see the development of free African American communities. We see strong communities developing as they are able to exert freedom in their movement. The creation of Black colleges was really important. These have become our historically Black colleges and universities, and often the purpose of these was to create Black teachers and ministers, because we see thousands of African Americans leaving primarily white dominated congregations to form their own churches, which was a cornerstone of many African American communities. However, as a result of the rise of Republicans and a lot of these changes in the South, we see the growth of white supremacist groups, the most famous of which was the KKK. And their goal was to restore democratic control of the South and reinforce white supremacy. So lots of violence occurring in the South as a result of the KKK. So, in response to this, there is a particular group that develops called the Exodusers, kind of taking the name from biblical terms. The Exodus is a book of the Bible where the Israelites leave slavery to get to the promised land. So, they're kind of taking that term Exodus, exit, to refer to African Americans who are moving out of the South and into specifically Kansas, where they formed many independent Black communities. You can look here at the population statistics between 1855 and 1880. And obviously, there was a mass exodus or a mass exit of African Americans out of the South to form these new Black communities. Moving on to political changes and continuities. In addition to the Reconstruction Amendments that we talked about in the previous lesson, there were other positive legislative acts that passed during this time. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared African Americans to be U.S. citizens. However, this is a law, which means it could be replaced by a future Democratic Congress. And so that led to the 14th Amendment, which would have been much more difficult to get rid of. In the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, the South was divided into military districts where the U.S. military was actually sent to the South to force them to follow Reconstruction policies. The Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 were in response to the growth of the KKK and other white supremacist groups. They were attempting to end violence and protect, especially the rights of African Americans. However, not very well enforced. Similarly, the Civil Rights of 1865 was it required equal accommodations in public places. However, again, not enforced. And so this becomes some of the major goals of African Americans in the 20th century. Now, there are several negative changes and continuities. For example, the Black codes. So, if you remember from early American history, we talked about slave codes. Black codes are going to be very similar. They just replace the word slave with black, and it really restricts the rights and movements. So, many of these Black codes would have enforced segregation or the separation of the races. The slaughterhouse cases end up being a series of Supreme Court cases linked together that limited the protections of the 14th Amendment. And then another Supreme Court case is going to be in response to a massacre against African Americans. And it's going to state that citizens' rights were to be protected by states, not the federal government. So when Southern states have white supremacist leaders, they're not going to protect those rights, and the federal government should be stepping in. But according to this court case, they won't. This court case ends up being overturned later. And then additionally, the Amnesty Act of 1872. This is removing the final restrictions on ex-Confederates. And so it's going to allow for Democrats to retake control of Southern government. So some pretty negative changes, returning the South to, in many ways, life before the Civil War. Here is a quote by radical Republican Thaddeus Stevens in response or kind of previewing the economic situation. We have turned or about to turn loose 4 million slaves without a hut to shelter them or a cent in their pockets. If we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better left them in bondage. So, what happens economically? Well, there is some additional funding from the federal government for rebuilding of roads, bridges, and canals. Not canals, bridges and railroads. Um, that's a positive change. But sharecropping ends up being just slavery by a new name. What happens in sharecropping is there's a contract between a landowner and a laborer. In many situations, this is the former owner and the African Americans who had been laboring on the plantation. So there's going to be no change in the personnel. In some cases, there was, but in many situations, African Americans will not leave the plantation because of various circumstances. Maybe they want to wait for family members to potentially return to them. Maybe they don't have another opportunity, or this is just where their community was set up. And so there's this contract between someone who had a position of power and someone who didn't, and it is not going to be an equal contract. And so the landowner is supposed to provide seed and other farm supplies, and the laborer will work the land and then give approximately half of the crops to the landowner to pay for that. So here is a contract from Thomas J. Ross. So Ross is going to furnish the land, and then he is going to get half of the cotton, corn, and wheat for the year after the expenses are deducted. The freedmen are going to plant, cultivate, and raise under the management of Ross. They promise to do good work and labor for 10 hours, and they will be docked for disobedience. If we carelessly, maliciously maltreat any of his stock, Ross will assess the damages from the wages. And so it's really, it's kind of a vague contract that gives the landowner a lot of power to reduce the wages. And so what happens in sharecropping is that many of the laborers end up making no money or continuing to be in debt every single year because they don't have the ability to fight against the landowner. They often don't know how to read or write, and so they aren't aware of the rights of the contract either. So, an additional economic change that happens is going to be the development of the convict lease system, where African Americans could be jailed indefinitely for crimes. And so, this is going to be part of like the black codes. They may be jailed for vagrancy or loitering, and it's because of a loophole in the 13th Amendment that allows for this convict lease system to happen. So, prisons can lend out or lease prisoners to companies like railroad companies or mines, where the prisoners will then labor for that company. And the company is going to then pay the prison or the state the wages of the workers. And so this is because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is abolished except as a punishment for a crime. And so African Americans who are being punished for a crime can then be put in a position of slavery according to this loophole in the 13th Amendment. This system is going to last into the 1920s. And in just one example, by 1880, up to 73% of Alabama's state revenue was derived from the convict lease system. So it actually was financially beneficial to the state of Alabama to arrest African Americans because they got money from companies like railroad companies. There was a super high death rate of around 25% for prisoners who were leased out to companies. So this is just a terrible system that developed in the South. Here you can see is a graph showing the history of the number of prisoners in Tennessee from 1865 to 1892. And you can see that the number of African American convicts rose rapidly in this period. So, to conclude, we want to look at the end of Reconstruction. So, we want to think about the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. During his presidency, it was characterized by corruption and scandal. Additionally, there was an economic recession in the period. These things increased support of the Democratic Party. There were also many costly programs, part of Reconstruction, that were raising taxes and increasing debt. And so, what really happens is we see a lot of Southern resistance to what's happening in Reconstruction, and Northerners becoming reluctant to continue to support Reconstruction because it was so costly. So, in the election of 1876, we see Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, going against Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat. And it was an extremely close election with 20 electoral votes being contested in the states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And both sides are going to claim victory. And so many historians contend that an informal compromise was made where the Republican Hayes could be president as long as they agreed to end Reconstruction. Those are the two main parts of the compromise, that Hayes would be president and Reconstruction would end, which means the military is going to leave the South. Additionally, the government will provide funding for infrastructure developments in the South. Hayes will have a Democrat on his cabinet, and Democrats will promise to respect the rights of African Americans. And so this is going to be the final straw. This is what ends Reconstruction. This is where Northerners basically shake their hands, wash their hands of it, and say, well, good luck to the South. Good luck to people that are trying to protect the rights of African Americans, because this was not going to be something that the federal government was really going to be involved in anymore. And so that really summarizes how Reconstruction ended and why it was a failure. I hope this lesson was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.